So on Sunday, I was talking a little bit about enculturated faith, this idea that there's no such thing as a faith that doesn't express itself through specific cultural practice. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, the bad thing is when we don't realize that our faith is encultured. John Barclay writes this about the passage. He says that the difference between strong and weak faith for Paul is the degree to which faith, although always expressed in cultural specific practice, is disaggregated from any one cluster of cultural norms. Now, what he's saying here is that for Paul, strong faith is never about what you eat. It was always about whether you could decouple your faith from the cultural practices you are comfortable with. Now, that does not mean that you do not participate in cultural practices anymore. And this is important. There is no such thing as an uncultured faith. A lot of the time, specifically, when we are part of the dominant culture, we tend to lose sight of culture. What happens is we start to believe that we are neutral and it's everyone else that has a culture. And yes, by the way, I am talking to all the white people in the room right now, but in the context of Romans, the issue here is that both sides are starting to believe that they are neutral and neither of them are recognizing their own enculturation. But after talking about that on Sunday, I actually came across a podcast this week talking about something related, something really interesting. On the You're Not So Smart podcast, they interviewed Michelle Gelfand, who studies tight and loose cultures and how cultural norms in different cultures can be tightened down when a society feels threatened, if they have ecological or political instability that forces them to draw those norms in more tightly so that everyone abides by them, or cultures can become more loose as they become more wealthy, more freer, or less afraid of different things that are constraining the culture.
Early research in anthropology actually distinguished between tight and loose societies. For example, agricultural societies that have a strong need for social coordination or for survival were found to be tighter than hunting and fishing societies. We can show why these cultures vary. They vary in the nature of their governments, how open or closed their media are. They vary in how much they suppress dissent. They vary in their criminal justice systems, how much monitoring there is, how much they're able to deter crime. They also vary, tight and loose societies, in terms of everyday situations. Loose societies afford a much wider range of behavior in various situations, like being in a park, or the movie theater, or restaurants.
But one of the things that was really interesting in the interview is she talked about how for us as human beings, particularly as we become more multicultural in our everyday life and work and relationships, we need to add a new layer to our thinking about intelligence. So we already have IQ. How smart are we? How able are we to solve problems in our world? A few years ago, decades ago, we added to that EQ. Are we able to pick up on the emotional signals that people are putting out? Are we able to adapt to different emotional situations that are coming up? And that becomes really important for our relationships. Well, now she says we need to add CQ to that, which is our cultural intelligence. How able are we to disassociate ourselves from our specific cultural practices that we're comfortable with, still to practice them, there's nothing wrong with that, but to understand them as culturally embedded? And how else are we able then to understand different cultural practices, to understand the beauty in them, to embrace them, to learn from them in different ways? And this becomes really important for us, not just for human beings who live in a multicultural world, but for us as Christians who want to follow the story of Jesus, who want to have a faith in Jesus that is disaggregated from our cultural practice. Are we able to celebrate different cultural practices that come into our communities? Are we able to learn from people who bring different expressions of cultural faith near us? Can we see the beauty in that? Do we see how it invites us to understand God in new ways? Can we embrace all of that in the ways that Paul is speaking about when he invites us to accept one another then just as Christ accepted us? So this week, think a little bit about that. What is your IQ? How do you solve problems? What is your EQ? How do you understand the emotional situations you find yourself in? And what is your CQ? Are you aware of your cultural biases? Are you able to identify and learn from different cultural practices that are around you? As we understand our intelligence in all of these different ways, I think we become more well-rounded people, able to actually learn from each other as best we can.